Bong Joon-ho makes really interesting movies, doesn't he? In fact, I'd argue that few directors in the history of cinema have mastered the art of controlled chaos quite like the Oscar-winning South Korean director. It's hard to explain, but his movies always seem to operate in this constant state of unpredictability, not just in terms of plot, but in the way they move fluidly between tones and genres, often within the same scene. With his latest film, Mickey 17, now released, I find myself drawn back to his earlier works, revisiting them with fresh eyes and a deeper appreciation for his evolution as a filmmaker. And so, in today's installment of everyone's favourite series on the channel, Worst to Best, we're taking a deep dive into the entire filmography of Bong Joon-ho. Let's begin. Yeah, you might think me putting Mickey 17 last in this list is a little crazy, considering it's the guy's newest movie. You know, made by a Bong Joon-ho at his most wise and experienced. But as I stated in my original review for the film, I just don't think that trademark controlled chaos of Bong Joon-ho feels that controlled here, if that makes sense. Like, instead of the precise, deliberate genre shifts that define his best work, Mickey 17 feels like it's constantly at war with itself, throwing so many ideas at the wall and just hoping that some of them will stick. There are too many characters, too many subplots, too many competing thematic through lines, and as a result, nothing quite lands with the weight it should. Sure, the movie seems fascinated by every concept it introduces, yet never stays focused on any of them long enough to develop fully. The premise itself is intriguing enough, a man employed as an expendable on a deep space colonization mission, repeatedly dying and being reprinted with his memories intact, but the film keeps expanding beyond that initial setup, introducing existential dilemmas, political satire, corporate greed, and even philosophical debates on identity and consciousness and alien welfare, all while juggling an ensemble of increasingly eccentric characters. Mickey 17 is the kind of film where you can just tell it must have been an absolute nightmare to edit. Like, don't get me wrong, you can feel the outlines of a much denser, richer film buried somewhere in here, but what we actually end up with just feels frustratingly scattered. Like the movie is stretching itself too thin, trying to be 7 different things at once. You know, in many ways, Mickey 17 feels like a victim of its own budget. Bong Joon-ho has always been a filmmaker who thrives on efficiency. He's never needed massive spectacle to make his ideas land. But here, with a staggering $118 million budget at his disposal, there's almost a sense that the sheer scale of the production worked against the film's strengths, leading to a bloated narrative that never quite locks into place. Sure, there's still plenty to admire, you know, great performances, striking visuals, the pure ambition of the thing, as well as, of course, that signature Bong Joon-ho absurdity. However, it is, at least for me, the least cohesive film in his entire body of work. Barking Dogs Never Bite, Bong Joon-ho's directorial debut, is, to put it simply, a film about frustration, both personal and societal. The story follows a struggling university lecturer who, overwhelmed by career setbacks and financial strain, finds himself irrationally fixated on a neighbour's incessantly barking dog. What starts as a petty annoyance spirals into something much darker as he takes increasingly desperate measures to silence it. Meanwhile, another woman at the apartment complex becomes entangled in his actions, leading to a strange and darkly comedic game of pursuit, misunderstandings, and absurd consequences. Yes, Bong Joon-ho's first ever movie is about dog violence, and even then he somehow manages to make it pretty funny. Beyond the absurdity of its premise, the film is an early showcase of Bong's ability to mix dark humour with biting social commentary. Unlike his later, more refined critiques of class, this one operates on a smaller, more intimate level. The upper class remains a distant, unseen force, while the lower class, those struggling to hold on to whatever scraps of power they can, turn on each other. It's a bleak, exaggerated, but painfully familiar depiction of survival under capitalism, where people become so consumed by their own frustration that they lash out at whatever is closest, no matter how trivial. However, the film's weirdly slapstick humour, along with the kind of upbeat, jazzy score it has, creates this really weird contrast with all the dog violence, and it really shouldn't work, but it just does, because, you know, it's Bong Joon-ho, this is what he's good at. That being said, Barking Dogs Never Bite is far from a perfect debut, of course. At nearly 2 hours, it overstays its welcome, and some of its digressions, while amusing, lack the tightness of Bong's later work. Still, it's an impressively assured first film, rough around the edges but undeniably unique, and an early sign of the filmmaker he would very soon become. Going into Okja, I kind of expected it to be one of those animal movies that just exists to make you cry. You know the type. But of course, I was silly to expect that from Bong Joon-ho. Instead, he takes what could have been a simple sentimental story and injects it with his signature weirdness, absurdity, and tonal unpredictability. The early sections of the film, set on a quiet farm in South Korea, feel like the closest we might ever get to live-action Studio Ghibli. You know, lush green landscapes, a simple but heartfelt friendship between a girl and her giant super pig, and a peaceful rhythm that lulls you into a false sense of security. But once Okja is taken from her home, the film rapidly evolves into something much bigger and messier, for better and for worse. Bong is just throwing everything at the screen here. You know, corporate satire, animal rights activism, absurd comedy, CG spectacle, and some of the darkest material he's ever put on film. The animal liberation front subplot is particularly brilliant. There's a certain chase scene that I'm thinking of which involves stopping tranquilizers with umbrellas, which was just pretty incredible as a set piece. However, with that being said, Okja never fully comes together in the way Bong's best films do, at least not in my opinion. The wildly different tones don't always gel, and as powerful as the film's message is, it does feel somewhat shallow and lessened given that Bong himself isn't a vegan or even a vegetarian. Which, yeah, I know, may come across as an eye-rolling comment to some, but I honestly think that most people who've actually seen this film would at least partially agree with me there. Unlike a film such as Parasite, which felt deeply personal, this feels more like Bong applying his signature style to an issue he finds interesting rather than one he's fully committed to, which is fine, obviously, but it just means that the message I believe the movie is trying to get across feels a little bit empty in the end, which is a shame. But nevertheless, Okja is one bold, strange experience with equal moments of quirky slapstick humor and really sobering heartbreak. I mean, geez, that scene in the end with the huge farm, that was rough. But yeah, this may not be one of Bong Joon-ho's best films, but I definitely still recommend watching it. On the surface, The Host is a monster movie, following a dysfunctional family as they desperately try to rescue their youngest member from the clutches of a mutated creature wreaking havoc along the Han River in Seoul. But like all of Bong Joon-ho's work, there's a lot more happening beneath the surface. See, rather than taking the typical horror or disaster movie approach of, you know, keeping the monster hidden for suspense, Bong actually just reveals it in broad daylight almost immediately, which just brings this really weird and unique vibe to the whole thing, reframing the film's focus away from the creature itself and more towards the systems and institutions that fail to protect people from it. Like, beyond the spectacle and, let's be honest, very dated CGI, The Host is packed to the brim with sharp political subtext. The American military presence in South Korea is framed as careless and destructive, kicking off the crisis with an act of environmental negligence and later escalating it through misinformation and fear-mongering. Meanwhile, the South Korean government is depicted as completely inept, more concerned with controlling the narrative than actually helping people. And Bong leans completely into this absurdity. Characters in hazmat suits trip over themselves, government officials contradict each other, and mass hysteria spreads faster than the actual threat. It's clever and, again, not something I was expecting. The film constantly plays with audiences' expectations, and it can lead to some really great moments. Like, for example, in the scene where the monster first appears and starts attacking people. We obviously have all of this commotion and craziness, and then Bong just cuts to this guy whose dog has just started attacking him for no reason. Maybe he saw an opening to escape or something. It's just funny. And sure, this at times goofy approach won't work for everyone, especially if you're expecting like your standard monster movie, but it does give the film this undeniable chaotic energy that just feels entirely its own. Overall, The Host is a fascinating blend of creature feature, dark comedy, political satire, and pretty strong family drama, which back in 2000 2006 really ended up cementing Bong Joon-ho as one of the most exciting filmmakers of his generation. It's easy to see why this became his international breakthrough. There's a confidence to the filmmaking that makes even its messier moments engaging. And sure, while I obviously wouldn't call it one of his absolute best, it is certainly one of his most interesting. Snowpiercer is a weird one, because sure, here we have that classic Bong Joon-ho juggling act of absurdity and class struggle and a ton of other visionary ideas. But then just thrown into the mix is this really dumb Hollywood action blockbuster sensibility, if you will. The thing is very loosely based off of some post-apocalyptic French graphic novel published in the early 80s that Bong just happens to pick up one day in a bookshop. And the result in practice is just this really weird, ambitious balancing act that probably shouldn't have worked, but it just kind of does, and it's fascinating to watch unfold. It's an action-packed dystopian thriller that operates as both a really unsubtle class allegory and a surreal, borderline cartoonish spectacle. At times it feels like Bong Joon-ho is making two entirely different movies at once, and yet somehow that chaotic blend of tones is exactly what makes it so compelling. The premise is simple enough. After a climate change experiment gone wrong plunges the world into an uninhabitable deep freeze, the last remnants of humanity survive on a constantly moving train, divided by class. The rich live in luxury at the front, while the poor are crammed into the squalid back, fed mysterious protein bars and controlled by heavily armed guards. When a revolution begins, led by Chris Evans, the group fights its way forward, each train car revealing a new and increasingly bizarre world, ranging from grimy industrial zones to aquariums, to an eerily cheerful classroom where kids are indoctrinated into worshipping the train's enigmatic creator. Now, I won't lie, the first act of this film is kind of rough, at least in my opinion. The early scenes in the tail section are sluggish, and while they're necessary to establish the stakes, they don't make for the most engaging start. The exposition is kind of clunky, and it doesn't exactly lead you to believe the rest of the film will be any more engaging. But once the revolution actually kicks into gear and the characters start pushing forward, the film finds its rhythm and just gets better and better. Moving through the train isn't just a plot device, it's a progression through layers of privilege, power, and excess, each space more ostentatious than the last. There's a real elegance here in how the film's momentum mirrors its themes. Just like its characters, the story is constantly moving forward, never repeating itself, never standing still for too long. I mean, to be honest, never standing still at all. And yeah, Snowpiercer is not exactly the most subtle thing ever made, but to me that's part of its charm. The class allegory is delivered with all the grace of a hammer to the skull, but Bong just somehow makes it work. Like he always does. I guess just by making the journey itself so exhilarating. The tonal shifts are completely unhinged here. One moment we're in a grim, violent uprising, the next we're watching Tilda Swinton deliver a Monty Python-esque performance, or sitting through a nightmarish elementary school lesson led by an unsettling, cheerful Alison Pill. Yes, as in, we are sex bomb 1, 2, 3, 4. Some of these moments might throw people off, but for me they just add to the film's singular energy. It never plays things safe, and even when it stumbles, it does so in a way that is just fun to watch. Like, Snowpiercer is just one of those movies that fully commits to itself, you know? It may not be the most refined or cohesive thing Bong has ever made, but it's nevertheless an incredibly bold and unpredictable juggling act. It's a dumb action movie, a satire, a fever dream, and a political statement all at once. Flawed, yes, but never boring. If there's one thing Bong Joon-ho understands better than most directors, it's how to keep an audience on edge. Mother is a psychological thriller neo-noir with a seemingly straightforward story. A mother desperately trying to clear the name of her mentally challenged son who's been arrested for the murder of a young woman. But that simplicity is, of course, deceptive. Bong plays the long game here, constantly shifting the story beneath your feet, pulling you deeper and deeper into the mystery while never letting you settle into familiar expectations. The more the mother investigates, the more the narrative warps. us, revealing cracks not just in what we thought was true, but in how we see the characters themselves. And yet, this never feels cheap. The film doesn't gaslight you, it builds a slow, creeping unease that eventually snowballs into something far more powerful and complex. At the center of it all is Kim Hye-ja, delivering what I think is one of the best performances in Bong's entire filmography. Her character is a relentless force, marching tirelessly around town, badgering police, interrogating suspects, doing whatever it takes really to uncover the truth. But Bong's far too smart to make her some one-dimensional hero. As the film unfolds, so does her desperation, her morality slowly bending under the weight of the love she has for her son. What begins as a quiet, determined care morphs into something obsessive, even dangerous. And Kim plays it all with incredible nuance, graceful one moment and frightening the next. This is definitely one of Bong Joon-ho's more serious movies. I mean, don't get me wrong, there's definitely still some moments which made me laugh, or which at least gave me respite from the slow, suffocating dread that builds as the story unfolds. But overall, Mother feels like Bong at his most stripped back and focused. His direction here is incredibly precise, every camera movement and cut calibrated to slowly tighten the noose around both the audience and the protagonist. Scenes that should feel straightforward are constantly undercut by strange, disorientating details, a car crash that seems to come out of nowhere, two surreal dance sequences which bookend the film. Even the crime itself is handled with eerie ambiguity. We never see the murder happen, just fragments of memory, like Rashomon or something, conflicting testimonies, and a growing sense that no one, not even the mother, is as innocent as they seem. Bong also plays with forensic investigation in a way that recalls memories of murder, treating the police and legal system with an almost darkly comic irreverence. This all contributes to just this overwhelming sense of isolation, where the only person who seems to care about the truth is the one least equipped to handle it. Ultimately, Mother is a film about the terrifying, irrational depths of unconditional love, and what happens when that love overrides everything else. It's a really gripping and memorable movie, and that's all I really have to say. Memories of Murder, Bong Joon-ho's second film, is surely, along with maybe the original Blade Runner, my favourite detective movie of all time. See, what makes it so exceptional isn't just the mystery at its core, but the way Bong uses the investigative structure to explore something far more existential and emotional. The film follows two detectives, Park, a local officer with a penchant for gut instinct and intimidation/torture, and Seo, a by-the-book professional from Seoul, as they attempt to track down a serial killer targeting young women in rural South Korea. But this isn't a story about clever clues or procedural breakthroughs. No, the investigation becomes a vehicle for something much darker, an examination of powerlessness in the face of chaos, of systems that fail over and over again, and of men who slowly come apart under the weight of not knowing. Bong's direction is razor sharp here, tonally fluid but never messy, visually meticulous but never cold. He fills the frame with fog, rain, mud, landscapes that feel both beautiful and unknowable. And the pacing is masterful, always pulling you forward with new leads and revelations, only to drop you back into uncertainty once again. But what really struck me on this rewatch was just how character-driven the whole thing is. Song Kang-ho, the GOAT, brings this clumsy swagger to Detective Park. He starts out cocky, dismissive, convinced he can read guilt on a man's face, but as the case wears on, that confidence erodes, until what's left is something completely hollowed out. And then we have Kim Sang-kyung as the quiet, rational Detective Seo, who's just got to be like one of the coolest characters in all of cinema in my opinion. He enters the film with this calm, stoic presence that immediately sets him apart, but by the end he's just as lost and desperate as everyone else, and watching that composure unravel is really quite devastating. Oh yeah, and something I only noticed on this most recent rewatch is how Park gradually starts mimicking his partner's wardrobe. It's subtle, but it says a lot about their dynamic, part respect, part insecurity. Very cool stuff. There's also just this bleak absurdity to the movie, like that one detective who jump kicks everyone, or that small vignette where Park spies at the public bathhouse because he thinks the killer might have shaven pubes. Oh man, it's so good, honestly. If like 99% of other directors had made Memories of Murder, it would easily be the best film in their entire filmography. But if there's one thing I've learnt about the guy over the past week, it's that Bong Joon-ho is no ordinary director, which brings us to the number one spot. In many ways, Parasite feels like the film Bong Joon-ho was always destined to create. It's the culmination of his entire filmography up until this point, much like Goodfellas was to Scorsese. It takes everything he's been playing with for the past 2 decades, you know, class dynamics, tonal shifts, absurdist humour, social critique, suspense, even slapstick, and fuses it into a single perfectly calibrated piece of filmmaking. You can trace its DNA all the way back to Barking Dogs Never Bite, with its small-scale frustrations under capitalism. It shares the host's chaotic energy and family dynamics, Snowpiercer's structural allegory, Okja's corporate satire, Mother's emotional intensity, Memories of Murder's precise character work, and yet Parasite never feels like a patchwork of past ideas. No, it feels like everything has been building to this. Every tonal swerve lands, every detail pays off. It's Bong operating at his most confident and refined. And the result is a film that feels totally effortless, even though of course it's anything but that. In fact, I think this is one of the most tightly edited films I've ever seen. So much of Parasite's power just comes down to timing. Bong Joon-ho and editor Yang Jin-mo construct entire sequences kind of like those Rube Goldberg machines, where each moment sets off the next with such precision that it becomes hypnotic at times. I mean, that perfect montage where the Kim family infiltrates the Park household is a masterclass in rhythm. It's playful, it's sharp, it's almost musical in the way it builds, and for a minute, you think this is the movie, this clever upstairs-downstairs grift, until it isn't, with a second montage that's somehow even better. And that's the real trick of Parasite, I think. It lures you in with its charm and wit and seemingly straightforward premise, only to pull the rug out with a mid-movie pivot that's so smooth you don't even realize it's happened until it's too late. Easily one of the best twists in cinema history. And from there, it just keeps spiraling. More tense, more absurd, more devastating. Every shot is purposeful. Every space meticulously designed to reinforce the social structure the film is deconstructing. The Park House isn't just a setting, it's a cross-section of class hierarchy. The deeper into it we go, the more claustrophobic it becomes. Bong's direction here is just ridiculous. He balances tone with the lightest touch, letting horror and humour bleed into one another without ever overplaying it. Man, it's just thrilling to watch someone this in control of their craft, operating at full capacity, firing on all cylinders. Don't get me wrong, I'm not one of those people who think this is a top 5 film of all time, but I do completely understand where people are coming from, and completely understand why Parasite became the award-winning, critically acclaimed juggernaut that it did back in 2019 and 2020. This is, in my opinion, the best film from one of the best and most interesting directors currently working. And that's going to be it. Bong Joon-ho, what a fun director and filmography to watch and discuss. I'd seriously recommend seeing all his films if you haven't already, and if you have, please let me know your own ranking in the comment section. I'm really intrigued to see what people are saying. But until then, until the next video, I will see you around.